Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to when you want to really get under the skin of huge, complex, sometimes really contradictory source materials and pull out the core insights you won't forget.
And today we're tackling something truly monumental. We're diving into a body of work that is, well, on the one hand, seen as the absolute spiritual core of Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah.
Right.
And on the other hand, it's frankly one of the most brilliant, maybe the most successful examples of pseudepigraphy that's false authorship in pretty much all of religious history. It's quite something.
We are going deep into the Sefer HaZohar, the Book of Splendor. And our mission today really is to tell you the whole story, no holding back.
Which means embracing that paradox.
Exactly. We'll explore the incredibly luminous, profound spiritual ideas that literally reshaped Western thought, but, we also have to confront the messy, complicated, frankly revolutionary history of how it came to be.
Uncovering all those contradictory sides.
Yeah, from its spiritual peaks right down to the, let's say, a very questionable authorship that actually made its success possible in the first place.
It's definitely a text that demands both intellectual honesty and, I think, a degree of spiritual awe. So, to start, maybe we should define it properly.
Good idea.
The Zohar is, without a doubt, the foundational text for Kabbalah, the most significant work in that entire literary tradition. But, and this is crucial, it's not really a single book penned at one time.
Right, you mentioned it's more like a collection.
It's a huge, complex textual corpus. Think of it as a group of books that sort of accumulated. We talk about the Gufa Zohar, the main body, but there are also these really important embedded narratives, later editions like the Tikkun HaZohar. It's sprawling.
Okay, so let's unpack that revolutionary nature you mentioned. It presents itself on the surface as a commentary on the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. That sounds pretty traditional. What's the fundamental approach, the mandate maybe, that makes it so radically different?
Well, its departure from tradition is pretty much absolute. You see, traditional rabbinic commentaries going back centuries mostly focus on one of two things.
Okay.
Either peshat, which is the plain, literal meaning of the text, or halakhic application, the legal rules and instructions you derive from it.
Standard stuff for rabbinic study.
Exactly. The Zohar basically just discards that prioritization completely. Its singular aim, its entire focus is the sud, the secret.
The mystical meaning.
Yes, it's dedicated solely to exploring the deeper, esoteric, symbolic, mythic meanings hidden, supposedly, within every single word, every letter, even the vowel points of the Bible.
Wow. So that's not just a slight change in emphasis, it's a total reframing. If the Zohar gets its way, the Torah, the foundational text for all of Judaism, isn't primarily about history anymore, or laws, or even moral guidance. What is it then?
It becomes this living, breathing, cosmic blueprint. The Zohar argues the Torah is way more than just history or law. It's a spiritual map of creation itself.
A map of the universe.
Pretty much. Revealing the inner workings of the cosmos, the dynamic relationship between God and everything that exists. And to get how it works, we need to look at that traditional four-level system of interpretation.
Pardeh.
Pardeh.
Yeah, right, the acronym. P for Peshat, literal. R, remez, hint. D, darash, homily. And S for Sod, the secret.
Precisely. Now, before the Zohar, all those levels were known, people talked about them. But it was really the first three, Peshat, Remez, Darash, that were seen as the main road, the required path for rabbinic life.
They were the focus.
Yes. The Zohar comes along and explicitly, unapologetically flips that. It prioritizes the final level, the mystical side, above everything else.
And that's inherently subversive, isn't it? Because if the literal text, the very stuff the legalistic rabbinic scholar spent centuries mastering, is just the surface, what does that make it in the Zohar's view?
Well, in Zoharic thinking, the literal text, the laws, the stories, the history, that's just the garment, or maybe the body of the Torah. It's the outside shell.
Just the clothing.
Right. And the real goal for the Kabbalist, the mystic, is to penetrate through that exterior, to get to the text's hidden soul, which are the mystical secrets of the Sod.
So by saying the literal legal stuff is just a soulless exterior,
Wow.
That's a massive critique of the whole Talmudic, legalistic way of approaching faith.
It's a radical critique.
Right.
Powerful, fundamental. It basically implies that a purely legalistic approach is missing the point, missing the soul.
That sounds like more than just a critique. It sounds like a bid for spiritual authority. It sets up a whole new hierarchy. The legal expert knows the rules, sure, they guard the body, but the mystic, who understands the soul of those rules, they're suddenly at the absolute top. That must have caused huge waves when it first appeared.
Oh, it absolutely did. And frankly, that tension is still there today. You see, the Zohar's scope is just massive. It aimed to reinterpret or even replace existing theology across the board. It covers mythical creation stories, the very nature of God, mystical prayer, redemption,
The whole package.
everything. And it also introduced this peculiar layer of, well, artifice that actually helps us pinpoint its real origin. The language itself is part of the performance, maybe. It's written mainly in this artificial Aramaic dialect.
Artificial? How so?
It was meticulously constructed in the 13th century. The whole point was to make it sound ancient, authoritative, like it came straight out of 2nd century Palestine, the time of the sages it claims to quote.
Okay, here's where the story gets really interesting and where we hit that core paradox of the Zohar head on. This text we've just described, this radical new spiritual constitution, it needed ancient roots to even survive, let alone thrive.
Exactly. Its history, its origins are completely tangled up with one of the most effective, most consequential examples of pseudepigraphy, false attribution in, well, maybe all of world literature.
Its success, its centuries of influence, its canonical status, it all hangs on that traditional claim of authorship.
Absolutely. Without that claim, the Zohar is essentially a fascinating 13th century Spanish mystical treatise. But with that claim, it becomes something close to divine revelation.
So what exactly was the claim? Who supposedly wrote it?
The claim, which was energetically promoted in 13th century Spain by a Kabbalist named Moses de Leon, was that the text wasn't written by him at all. It was a discovery.
Found, not written.
Precisely. The claim was it recorded the secret, ancient teachings of the highly revered 2nd century sage, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Reshape as he's known.
Reshape. I mean, he's a giant figure from the Mishnaic era, huge authority, untouchable spiritual status. What was the story they attached to him? How did he supposedly get these teachings?
The narrative was powerful. It stated that these divine secrets, these core mystical texts, were actually revealed to Reshape and his circle of disciples while he and his son were hiding from Roman persecution.
Right, the famous story of hiding in a cave.
For 13 years, supposedly, studying, meditating, and receiving these profound hidden teachings directly. And for centuries after, that origin story gave the Zohar this incredible sanctity, a status normally only given to the Torah itself or the Talmud. It effectively cemented its place right inside the sacred canon of Judaism.
That's immense power. And it totally explains why someone like De Leon might, well, attempt the deception. But hold on, how did this enormous body of work, supposedly written in a cave back in the 2nd century, just suddenly pop up in Spain in the 1280s? Out of nowhere.
Well, that was the immediate red flag for some people, even back then. It didn't emerge slowly from some ancient library. It just appeared.
Yeah.
Suddenly made its appearance, as the sources say.
Suspicious.
Very. And the first really dramatic public piece of evidence that fueled this skepticism comes from a 14th century Kabbalist named Isaac of Acre. He tells this incredible story. Apparently, after Moses de Leon died, Isaac actually traveled to try and find the source of these manuscripts. He wanted to see the original ancient texts for himself.
He went looking for the proof, and where did his search lead him?
Straight to de Leon's home, to his widow.
Okay.
And Isaac of Acre claims that de Leon's own widow eventually confessed the truth to him. She supposedly admitted that her husband, Moses de Leon, had authored the entire thing himself, from his own mind, as the account says.
He wrote it all.
That's the claim. And that he attributed it to the ancient sage Reshape for, well, two pretty cynical, but you have to admit, incredibly effective reasons. Money and prestige.
Financial gain and reputation.
Exactly. There's that famous brutal quote attributed to her that just perfectly captures this strategy. She allegedly said that for his own words they would not give a penny, but for the divinely inspired work of Simeon ben Yochai they will pay in blood.
Yeah. Pay in blood. That really tells you something about the desperation for spiritual authenticity back then and the sheer currency, both spiritual and economic, that came with attaching RSB's name to something.
It was the ultimate stamp of approval. And contemporaries, like Joseph ibn Wakar, they smelled a rat pretty quickly. They suspected it was a forgery almost immediately.
So why didn't their opposition stop it? Why did the rationalists, the skeptics, lose this fight? How did it still become canonized?
That's a great question. They failed partly because de Leon's forgery was actually incredibly well done, especially for its time, and partly because the spiritual hunger for what the Zohar offered that sod, that deep in meaning, was just overwhelming.
The demand was too high?
Exactly. The rationalist arguments were there early on, but they didn't have the kind of definitive, knockdown proof needed to overturn such a powerful religious claim that really only came much, much later.
In the 20th century, right, with modern academic scholarship.
Yes, particularly the rigorous source-critical work of scholars like Gershom Scholem. He basically solidified the academic consensus, which is now overwhelming and pretty much absolute,
And that consensus is?
that Moses de Leon was indeed the primary author. He composed the bulk of the main sections of the Zohar between roughly 1280 and 1286.
Okay, let's dig into that hard evidence, the stuff that finally settled the debate for scholars. Where did De Leon slip up? What are the smoking guns?
Well, the evidence is layered, and is pretty decisive. First, there's the linguistic proof. Like we mentioned, the Zohar isn't written in authentic 2nd century Palestinian Aramaic.
It just sounds like it.
Right. Scholem and others demonstrated conclusively that its Aramaic is an artificial dialect. It's a 13th century literary construct. It cleverly mixes different Aramaic styles to confuse the reader, but critically, it's riddled with grammatical errors. Mistakes that no genuine 2nd century master scholar, fluent in the language of the Talmud, would ever have made.
So a convincing fake, but flawed if you looked closely enough grammatically.
And worse for the claim of antiquity, the text contains clear, suspicious traces of Arabic and Spanish words and sentence patterns, little linguistic fingerprints that betray its actual origin in medieval Spain.
So vocabulary and grammar from his own time and place leaked in.
They did. De Leon even seemed to intentionally use what scholars sometimes politely call Aramaic-seeming gibberish in some of the really obscure, difficult passages. Basically, nonsense words designed to sound profound and ancient, to give this false impression of deeply esoteric knowledge that maybe we moderns just couldn't grasp. It was like linguistic camouflage, meant to intimidate you into accepting its authority.
Fascinating. Okay, language is one thing. You also mentioned anachronisms, historical clues that give away the text's true age. Those must be even harder to fake.
Absolutely, and the Zohar is full of them. Tiny details that simply couldn't have been known or relevant in the 2nd century. It contains, for instance, specific references to historical events of the post-Talmudical period.
Like what?
Well, things related to the Crusades, for example, which happened mainly between the 11th and 13th centuries, more than 800 years after RSH happened.
Okay, that's pretty damning.
And maybe the most charmingly specific example, one pointed out back in the 19th century. The Zohar offers this deep, mystical explanation for a particular style of mezuzah, the parchment scroll on the doorpost. But the style it describes was only introduced, standardized really, in the 13th century.
So R.H. couldn't possibly have been commenting mystically on an artifact that didn't even exist in that form until Moses de Leon's own lifetime.
Exactly. It's these little details that betray the forgery.
And then the final nail in the coffin, you said, was comparing the Zohar to de Leon's other writings, the ones he published under his own name.
Yes, the source critical analysis. This was devastating. Scholars found that many key philosophical ideas, even specific passages within the Zohar, are essentially direct Aramaic translations, or sometimes very close paraphrases, of Moses de Leon's own known Hebrew philosophical works.
He was recycling his own material.
He was. He basically took his own contemporary 13th century philosophy, dressed it up in this faux ancient Aramaic, sprinkled it with mystical terminology and drama, and then attributed the whole package to an untouchable saint from the past.
So the academic verdict is clear. It's a pious fraud. But let's pause on that term. We're talking about a massive intellectual deception here, seemingly done for spiritual ends. How did the generations after the truth started coming out reconcile the undeniable spiritual power and depth of this text with the moral compromise is how it was created?
That really is the core tension, isn't it? And it's why we use that specific term, pious fraud. For someone like De Leon, and for those who defended the Zohar's sanctity later, the pseudepigraphy wasn't just some minor detail. It was the essential vehicle needed for radical theological change.
You mean the fraud was necessary for the ideas to take root?
That's the argument. How do you reconcile it? Well, the idea is that the innovation itself, the new mystical system, was deemed so spiritually vital, so necessary to rescue Judaism from what De Leon and others saw as a kind of dry, legalistic stagnation, that the means, the forgery, were justified by the perceived divine ends.
Because a 13th century Spanish Kabbalist named Moses could never have just published this stuff under his own name and expected it to be accepted.
Absolutely impossible. His work would have been condemned instantly, branded as heresy, probably suppressed by the dominant rabbinic authorities of the time.
But by putting the words in Arishbai's mouth.
By attributing it to the sainted, untouchable Arishbai, De Leon executed this brilliant theological Trojan horse maneuver. He smuggled his revolutionary 13th century system directly into the ancient, unassailable canon. So in this view, the forgery wasn't just incidental. It was the central, clever mechanism behind the Zohar's incredible success. Its power is, in a strange way, inseparable from its fake origins, because the fraud allowed the soul, the mystical ideas, to sneak past the guardians of the body, the established tradition.
Okay, so we understand the origins now, this necessary fraud creating a new sacred text. Let's shift from the author to the structure itself. You mentioned earlier it feels less like a single systematic book and more like a collection, a library, maybe even a script sometimes. Why is that?
Well, that composite feeling was also arguably part of the strategy, part of the performance.
Hmm.
Moses de Leon seems to have intentionally structured the work to mimic the way truly ancient canonical texts like the Talmud or the Midrash developed organically, accumulating over generations.
He made it look old by making it look messy.
In a way, yes. It's presented as this unsystematic composition, a dynamic group of books that contains, scholars have counted, over 21 distinct literary styles and forms. This patchwork structure deliberately reinforced the claim that it was a discovered tradition, something compiled from multiple sources over many years, not the work of a single author in a short period.
Clever. Okay, let's dive into some of the key parts, the specific sections within this library that give the Zohar its unique feel and its spiritual punch. Where does the core theology really begin inside this structure?
It arguably starts with the most mysterious, most foundational piece, the Sifra Disnuita, which means the Book of Concealment or Book of Modesty.
Okay.
This section is incredibly short, maybe only 6 pages long in most editions, and it's written in this incredibly dense, metaphorical, highly cryptic Aramaic. It basically lays out the core cosmogony, the absolute origin of the worlds, the deepest secrets of creation, but in a series of profound hints and veiled allusions.
Like a code.
Almost exactly like a code. It provides the hidden, encoded vocabulary, the fundamental building blocks that the rest of the massive Zohar then has to spend hundreds of pages trying to unpack, explain, and elaborate on. It's the seed from which the rest grows.
So it sets up the central mystery, and then the Zohar moves into these incredibly dramatic, almost play-like sections, the assemblies, the Idrot.
Yes, the Eder Rabbah and the Eder Zuta. These are really the ecstatic narrative heart of the main body of the Zohar. The Eder Rabbah, which means the Greater Assembly, describes this formal gathering. RSHBI convenes with 10 of his core disciples.
The inner circle.
Right, and their purpose is to discuss the deepest secrets of divinity, specifically trying to decode the hints that were hidden back in that Sifra Disnuita.
And what's striking here is the sheer intensity. It's not just a palm philosophical discussion.
Not at all. It's extreme. The discourse, the revelation of secrets, is described as being so spiritually overwhelming, the influx of divine light is so intense that 3 of the 10 sages participating literally die.
Die. As in drop dead.
Yes. From ecstatic union with the divine light during the discussion itself. It's presented not as a metaphor for deep thought, but as a real, physical, mortal consequence of accessing ultimate, unbearable truth.
Wow. That's terrifying. Did that idea scare people away from studying it, or did it actually enhance the mystique? Because on one hand, it sounds lethal. On the other, it makes the secrets feel incredibly powerful and real.
I think it mostly enhanced the allure, while also powerfully reinforcing the need for caution and preparation. It functioned as this incredible narrative device to immediately establish the stakes for anyone reading it. The Zohar is basically telling you from the outset, look, the secrets in here are so potent, they can literally kill you if you're not ready.
So it validates the idea that you need restrictions on who can study it.
Exactly. It suggests only the most spiritually pure and prepared individuals can handle this level of divine influx without shattering, just like the vessels we'll talk about later.
Okay. And the climax of this whole narrative arc within the Zohar is the Idra Zuta.
Yes, the Lesser Assembly. This section is set on the very day of Areshbai's death. As he's lying on his deathbed, his final act is to give one last, culminating explanation of the secrets. Things that were perhaps too profound, too dangerous to fully reveal even in the Greater Assembly.
His final testament.
Precisely. This section is positioned as containing the absolute deepest summary of his teachings, revealed right at the moment his soul is departing the world. This invests it with ultimate authority and also this profound sense of pathos, finality, and urgency.
We mentioned earlier that the Zohar kept growing even after De Leon died, which suggests that composite library strategy really worked. People kept adding rooms to the building. What about those later editions?
Absolutely. It became a kind of living canon. The Zohar acted like a magnet, drawing in other mystics who continued to compose material in its style. Often this was done by a particularly skilled 14th century imitator who really mastered De Leon's artificial Aramaic.
Some more pseudepigraphy, building on the original?
In a way, yes. Two of the most important editions, often bound with the main Zohar, are Raya Mahimna, which means the faithful shepherd, and Tikkun HaZohar, rectifications to the Zohar.
What are they about?
Raya Mahimna is fascinating. It's structured as a series of dialogues where Moses, the faithful shepherd himself, appears to RASB and explains the hidden cosmic purpose behind each of the mitzvot, the commandments of the Torah.
So connecting every law to the mystical structure.
Exactly. And the Tikkun HaZohar really doubles down on that idea of infinite hidden meaning packed into finite text.
How so?
Well, the Tikkun HaZohar is this huge, dedicated work consisting of 70 distinct rectifications or commentaries. And what's the subject of all 70 of these deep, complex commentaries?
Let me guess. Something profound.
The very first word of the Torah, Bereshit, in the beginning.
70 commentaries on one word.
70 different ways to crack open that single word, revealing its hidden facets, its secret connections to the Sephiro, its implications for the entire structure of creation. It's an incredible demonstration of the Zoharic method. So this whole complex, deliberately sprawling, maybe even confusing architecture, it wasn't an accident. It was a carefully built literary strategy that successfully positioned the Zohar as kind of parallel mystical Talmud, a rival canon to the established rabbinic tradition.
Okay, let's shift gears now. We've wrestled with the history, the origins, the structure. Let's get into the substance. What does this revolutionary text, smuggled in via forgery, actually teach? You said it provided a new, dynamic language for God, moving beyond the idea of just a distant lawgiver.
Yes, that dynamic language is really the heart of its innovation. The Zohar introduces this incredibly complex, nuanced system that makes a crucial distinction. It distinguishes between God as God is, in God's own unknowable essence, and God as God reveals himself and interacts with the world he created.
Starting with God before creation, the absolute source.
Exactly. We begin with the absolute Godhead, the macrocosm, as it's sometimes called. And the term for this is Ein Sof.
Meaning without end or the infinite.
Precisely. This is the Godhead in its ultimate, absolute, totally transcendent state. It's the reality prior to his self-manifestation, as the text put it, pure, undifferentiated, infinite being. And the Zohar stresses just how remote and unknowable this state is. It's described as being alone, without form and without resemblance to anything else. You are forbidden, even in your deepest thoughts, to try and give the Ein Sof any kind of form or comparison.
Okay, but if this ultimate source is totally beyond us, completely unknowable, how does the Zohar even begin to talk about its connection to us, to our finite world? How does the infinite touch the finite?
It introduces this profound paradox right at the start. It often refers to the Ein Sof using another term, ayin, which translates as nothingness.
Nothingness. That sounds empty or negative.
Right, but we have to be incredibly careful with that word ayin. It doesn't mean non-existence in the way we usually think of it. It means God is no thing, no specific, definable, finite thing that our minds can possibly grasp or categorize.
So not an absence, but an absence of limitation.
Exactly. The Ein Sof is above all conception. It's so utterly unified, so absolute, that from our limited human perspective, it so transcends human understanding as to be practically non-existent. If you try to mentally grab onto it, your mind comes back empty, because there are no handles, no divisions, no things to grab, hence nothingness.
Okay, I think I get it. It's like the ultimate 0 point of pure potentiality before anything becomes distinct.
That's a good way to put it. But this immediately creates the central problem for Zoharic cosmology. How does this static, unified, unknowable nothingness give rise to a dynamic, differentiated, knowable everything? How do you get from Ein Sof to the universe?
And the answer, the bridge between the infinite Ein Sof and our reality, is the Sephiro.
Yes. The Sephiro are the absolute core structure of Zoharic thought. They are understood as 10 divine emanations. Think of them as channels, or maybe vessels or attributes, through which the infinite light of God, the Or Ein Sof, flows down into the world.
They're the pathway.
They are the pathways, the mechanisms by which the infinite manages to reach and interact with the finite. They make creation possible, they make interaction possible, and crucially, they make divine human communication possible.
Now, we need to be really clear here. 10 divine emanations. This sounds potentially polytheistic to modern ears. How did the Zohar maintain God's absolute unity?
That's a critical point, and the Zohar is absolutely rigorous about it. It constantly emphasizes the absolute unity of God.
Mhm.
The Sephiro are not 10 separate gods or independent powers. They're described as 10 aspects of his divine presence, maybe like 10 different facets of a single diamond or 10 different lenses through which the divine reality expresses itself.
You mentioned an analogy with light.
Yes, that's a very common one. Imagine the single, pure, colorless, unified light of the Ein Sof. Now, imagine that light passing through a prism. It refracts into 10 distinct colors, right?
Red, orange, yellow.
So the Sephirot are like those 10 colors, 10 distinct divine attributes or modes of action, like Chesed, which is mercy, or loving kindness, or Gevurah, which is judgment or strength, or Malkut, which is kingdom or presence. They look distinct, they act distinctly, but they're all fundamentally just refractions of the same original single unified light.
Okay, that helps. And these 10 attributes, they aren't just a static list, right? They're organized dynamically. There's a structure.
Oh, absolutely. It's a highly dynamic system. They're typically arranged in a structure often visualized as the tree of life, usually organized into 3 vertical columns or pillars. This structure is crucial for maintaining cosmic balance.
3 pillars, what are they?
On the right side, you have the pillar of mercy. This embodies qualities like expansion, outflow, love, grace. It's dominated by the Sephira of Chesed, mercy. On the left side, you have the pillar of judgment or severity. This embodies restriction, limitation, rigor, discernment. It's dominated by Gevurah, judgment or strength.
And these 2 pillars are naturally in tension, like expansion versus contraction.
Exactly. They're in constant dynamic tension. The Zohar teaches that if the universe were governed only by the right pillar, by pure unrestrained Chesed, it would basically dissolve into infinite formless love. There'd be no structure, no distinct beings.
Okay.
But if it were governed only by the left pillar, by pure Gevurah, it would be instantly crushed by unbearable judgment and severity. Existence couldn't withstand it.
So neither extreme works on its own.
Right. Which means the most crucial pillar is the one running down the middle, the central pillar, the pillar of balance or equilibrium.
What's in the middle?
This pillar contains key Sephiro, like Tiferet, which means beauty or compassion, and also Keter, the crown, at the very top. The central pillar acts to harmonize the opposing forces. It blends the expansion of mercy with the restriction of judgment, allowing existence to unfold in a stable, balanced flow. Tiferet, in particular, is seen as embodying that perfect harmony, the beauty that results from mixing love and discipline correctly.
And the very last Sephira, the 10th one, Malkut, or kingdom, which sits at the bottom of the structure. That's the one closest to us, to our physical world.
Precisely. Malkut is often identified with the Shekinah, the indwelling divine presence in the world. It's considered the ultimate feminine aspect of the divine within this system. It represents the point where all the divine light and energy flowing down through the other 9 Sephiro finally manifests as intangible reality in our world.
And you mentioned a cosmic drama.
Yes, within this Sephirotic system, there is a central cosmic drama constantly unfolding. It often involves the relationship, the unification between the primary male aspect, often associated with Tiferet, representing God's act of compassion, and the female aspect, the Shekinah or Malkut, representing God's presence within creation. Very often, the Shekinah is described as being in a state of exile, separated from her divine partner.
Like the Jewish people in exile.
Exactly. This separation is experienced in our world as brokenness, suffering, and incompleteness. And the entire cosmic process, according to the Zohar, is driven by the yearning for their ultimate reunion, their Yichud, or unification.
Okay, that is the macrocosm, the map of God. Now, how does this connect down to the individual person, the microcosm? You talked about mystical psychology.
This is really where the Zohar becomes incredibly personal and potent. It teaches that the human soul isn't just something created by God, it's actually a hidden part of God.
A spark of the divine.
More than a spark, almost a miniature replica. The Zohar takes the biblical phrase, man is created in the divine image, extremely literally and mystically. It means the structure of the human soul directly mirrors, holographically reflects, the structure of the 10 Sephiro. What happens up there in the divine map is precisely mirrored down here in the architecture of the human soul. This creates this profound innate kinship between humanity and God.
So our inner life reflects the cosmic life. And the soul itself, like the Sephiro, isn't just one simple thing. It has levels.
Exactly. The soul isn't monolithic. The Zohar describes 5 distinct levels or dimensions of consciousness, 5 names of the soul. And these levels aren't automatically present. They're acquired or activated based on a person's spiritual development and merit. And crucially, these 5 levels correspond directly to the Sephiroth and also to the different Kabbalistic worlds or planes of reality.
Okay, let's walk through them, starting at the bottom, the most basic level.
That's the Nefesh. This is the lowest level, the basic life force or animal soul. It's directly connected to the physical body and the physical world, the world the Kabbalists call Asiya, action.
So it powers our basic existence.
Yes, its main expression is in physical action, doing things, performing the commandments physically, the biological drive to survive. It's the soul of the body animating it.
Okay, moving one step up, into the emotional realm.
That brings us to Ruach, which means spirit or wind. This level corresponds to the next world up, Yetzirah formation, which is associated with the emotions in the heart. Ruach relates to our moral character, our feelings. Its primary work is described as the toil of the heart, that internal effort needed to cultivate feelings like love and awe of God, to refine our emotional responses.
So Nefesh is action, Ruach is emotion. What's next? Intellect.
Precisely. The third level, and the highest of the 3 generally considered accessible to most people through normal religious life, is Neshama. This means soul or breath. It corresponds to the world of Bria, creation, and is linked to the pure intellect.
Conceptual understanding.
Yes, the Neshama allows for the conceptual grasp of divine truths, the intellectual understanding of God, Torah, and the cosmos. It's the seat of higher awareness and contemplation. These 3, Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, or Naran for short, are the standard package, so to speak.
But the Zohar doesn't stop there. There are 2 even higher, more esoteric levels, reserved for the true mystics.
That's right. Above Neshama, we enter a realm that's much more directly connected to the divine light itself. The 4th level is Chaya, which means living or life. It's often understood as the indwelling divine life force that continuously sustains all the lower levels.
Where does it connect cosmically?
Chaya corresponds to the highest of the 4 main worlds, the world of Atzilut, emanation. This is the world of the Sephiroth themselves. So at the level of Chaya, the soul isn't just contemplating God from below, it's achieving direct communion with the divine reality as it emanates, as God transcends the lower created world.
Okay. And the absolute pick, the ultimate level.
The 5th and highest level is Yeshida, meaning singular or unique. This represents the absolute pinnacle of the soul's connection to its source. On this level, the soul is no longer even experienced as separate. It is the indivisible spark of the Creator itself, inherently and immutably bound to the Ein Sof, the Holy One. It corresponds to the very highest Sephiroth, Keter, the crown. Accessing Yeshida is described as achieving absolute, unmediated union with the Godhead, the ultimate mystical experience.
So we have this stunning symmetry. The divine structure, the Sephiroth, the macrocosm, is perfectly mirrored in the potential structure of the human soul, the microcosm. What does this mean practically? What are the implications for human action? Because it sounds like the Zohar is doing something radical here, shifting the whole relationship. We're not just passive subjects obeying a distant king anymore.
Exactly. We become active partners. That perfect mirroring, that microcosm-macrocosm connection is the engine driving the Zohar's most revolutionary practical teaching. This is the concept often called theurgy.
Theurgy, meaning?
Meaning human actions can directly influence the divine realms. Because the human soul mirrors the divine structure, the actions of the mystic, and really, the Zohar suggests, the actions of every righteous person, whether they realize it or not, have direct, tangible, cosmic consequences.
How so?
When a Kabbalist performs a mitzvah, commandment, with the proper intention, Kavanah, or when they engage in deep, contemplative prayer to align their own inner Sephiroth, they're not just doing something for themselves or merely obeying an external God. They are actively participating in the divine process itself. They are performing an act of, as the Zohar puts it, repairing the Shekinah.
So by acting correctly down here, you are literally fixing or balancing things up there, aligning the Sephiroth and the Godhead through your actions.
That's the core idea. Humanity becomes the indispensable agent for sustaining creation itself. Our actions can bring harmony and balance not just to Earth, but to the divine structure. Or, conversely, negative actions can increase the imbalance and exile above. This gives human life this incredibly profound participatory role in the cosmos. It transforms Judaism from potentially being seen as just a religion of obedience into this dynamic theurgic system where, in a sense, the fate of the universe hinges on human behavior.
Okay, so the Zohar itself lays this incredible groundwork in the 13th century, but you mentioned earlier that despite its power, it didn't really explode into mass consciousness, the kind of influence that reshaped Judaism globally until the 16th century. What happened? What historical event triggered this profound second life for the Zohar?
You really have to draw a direct line from the Zohar's massive renaissance in the 16th century to the catastrophic trauma of 1492, the expulsion of the Jews from
The
Spain.
Spanish expulsion.
Yes. This event was an unimaginable national disaster. It scattered entire thriving communities, destroyed centuries of cultural and intellectual life, and plunged the Jewish world into a deep, traumatic theological crisis.
Why did God let this happen? That must have been the burning question.
Exactly. The exiled communities, suffering profoundly, became intensely preoccupied with questions of exile, redemption, the Messiah. They desperately needed a spiritual framework, a theology that could make sense of their suffering, explain why God had allowed such a terrible fate to befall them.
And the Zohar, with its mystical framework of cosmic drama and hidden meanings, provided the raw material for that explanation.
It did. And the absolute center of this mystical renaissance, this deep dive into the Zohar to find answers, became the city of Safed in the Galilee region of Ottoman Palestine. Many of the expelled Spanish scholars and mystics gathered there.
And it was in Safed that the key figure emerged who would reinterpret the Zohar for this traumatized generation.
Yes. Rabbi Isaac Luria Ashkenazi, usually known as the Ari, which means the lion. Luria lived only a short time, from 1534 to 1572, but his impact was immeasurable. He's widely considered the master interpreter of the Zohar and really the father of contemporary Kabbalah.
What did he do? Did he just explain the Zohar better?
He did much more than that. Luria essentially built upon the Zohar's foundations to create a completely new, dynamic, and mythic cosmic narrative, what we now call Lurianic Kabbalah. And this narrative was specifically constructed to provide a profound mystical interpretation of exile and a clear pathway towards redemption. It spoke directly to the trauma of 1492.
He didn't just read the Zohar. He mythologized its concepts, turning the Sephirah and the divine light into this epic, almost cinematic cosmic story, a drama.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Luria mapped out this sequential cosmic drama, starting with a truly shocking first act, divine contraction.
Contraction. God shrinking.
In a manner of speaking, this is the famous Lurianic concept of Sinsum. Luria taught that before creation could even begin, the Ein Sof, the infinite, undifferentiated Godhead, had to perform an act of profound divine self-limitation. It had to, in a sense, hide itself and contract inward, withdrawing its infinite light from a conceptual point or space. This created a void, a kind of primordial empty space called the Tehiru.
And into this void.
Into this void, this
Yeah.
vacuum created by God's own withdrawal, existence could then be emanated or poured. Luria argued that without this initial voluntary withdrawal of the infinite, there would simply be no room, conceptually speaking, for a finite, independent world to exist. Everything would just be absorbed in the infinite light.
So creation itself begins with a necessary act of divine self-exile, God pulling back from a part of reality to make space for otherness. That sounds eerily parallel to the Jewish historical experience of exile.
It is the ultimate theological parallel, and that's entirely the point. It reframes exile not just as a human condition, but as inherent in the very structure of creation. But the drama doesn't stop there. It immediately continues with a catastrophe.
A catastrophe after the contraction.
Yes. This is the concept of Shivarat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. Luria taught that as the divine light began to flow from the Ein Sof into the structure of the 10 Sephirot, which now functioned as Kalim, or vessels, designed to contain and channel that light, something went terribly wrong.
What happened?
The intensity of the divine light pouring into the lower 7 Sephirot was simply too immense. Those vessels weren't strong enough, they couldn't handle the pressure, and they catastrophically shattered, broke apart. Luria presented this not as part of God's plan, but as a kind of divine accident, a cosmic crisis, a flaw, right at the beginning of creation.
Wow, a cosmic shattering. This sounds like it would explain why the world we live in feels so broken, flawed, imperfect.
Precisely. It provides a mythic origin story for the fundamental brokenness of existence. And according to Luria, this shattering had two critical consequences.
What were they?
First, the divine light itself, which had been contained in the vessels, fractured into countless tiny fragments. These are called netzitzot, or divine sparks. And these sparks fell down into the primordial chaos, into the void created by the Tzimtzum.
Okay, sparks of God's light scattered everywhere. What was the second consequence?
The shards of the broken vessels themselves didn't just disappear, they fell too, and they transformed into something negative. They became the klippot, which literally means husks or shells.
Husks,
Yeah.
like coverings.
Yes. These clipots represent the dimensions of reality that are opaque to divinity. They are the material, the profane, sometimes even the demonic or evil elements of existence. And their primary characteristic is that they envelop, imprison, and conceal the fallen sparks of divine light.
So our world, the reality we experience, is fundamentally defined by this state of cosmic exile, where tiny fragments of God's own light, netzutzat, are trapped inside these shells or husks, klipot, of materiality and negativity.
That is the Lurianic diagnosis of reality. We are living through the wreckage of that initial cosmic shattering. Particles of God are literally lost and trapped within the fabric of our imperfect world.
That's a pretty bleak picture. But it must lead somewhere positive, because you said Luria offered a path to redemption.
Absolutely. This diagnosis leads directly to the central, transformative, and ultimately optimistic concept of Lurianic Kabbalah, Tikkun Olam, which means the restoration or repair of the world.
Tikkun Olam. I've heard that phrase used more broadly today, often in social justice contexts.
Yes, it's had a long history, but Luria gave it this incredibly specific and urgent cosmic meaning. Remember how the Zohar taught that human actions could affect the Shekinah?
That's the theurgic idea.
Luria took that kernel and radicalized it. He elevated it into the absolute central purpose of all human existence. Lurianic Kabbalah teaches that every single human being has not just the ability, but the obligation, the cosmic duty, to actively participate in liberating those trapped sparks of light from the klipot. Tikkun, restoration, becomes the meaning of history, the purpose of life.
So performing the mitzvot, the commandments, it's not just about obeying God anymore, or even just balancing the Sephiroth like in the Zohar.
It becomes a cosmic rescue mission. In Lurianic thought, every righteous action, every prayer said with intention, every act of kindness, every mitzvah performed correctly, every moment of study is literally an act of Tikkun Olam. It actively pries open a klippa, frees a trapped divine spark, and sends it back upward towards its source.
You're literally helping to gather the fragments of God's shattered light.
Precisely. You are participating in the mending of the broken cosmos. And Luria taught that only when all the sparks are freed will Ein Sof become whole again. Only then can the original divine plan be fulfilled, ushering in the perfected world, the Messianic age.
Okay, let's connect this back to the bigger picture. The trauma of 1492. Luria's system seems to provide this breathtaking, immediate, and empowering answer to the suffering of the exiled Spanish Jews.
It was an act of incredible theological creativity and profound spiritual resilience. Think about the core problem they faced. Why has God allowed this? Why are we, his chosen people, suffering in exile, scattered across the earth?
The question that haunted them.
Luria answered it with staggering brilliance. You are in exile because God himself is in exile. The cosmic catastrophe, the Shevarat HaKelim, the shattering of the vessels, that is the primordial root of Galut, of historical exile. God's initial withdrawal symptom and the subsequent shattering created the conditions for exile, both divine and human.
So our suffering mirrors God's own brokenness. We're not being punished. We're sharing God's fate.
More than just sharing it, we are the agents meant to heal it. Luria's system completely reframed the meaning of Jewish suffering and dispersion. It wasn't a sign of rejection or punishment. Instead, the Jewish people were scattered across the globe by divine design, Luria argued, precisely so they could be present in every corner of the world to find and liberate the sparks hidden there in those specific places and cultures.
It transforms the victim into the hero.
Exactly. It turned the suffering, wandering Jew from a passive victim of history into the indispensable protagonist of the entire cosmic drama of redemption. This massive mythological reframing gave the exiled communities the spiritual purpose, the meaning, and the resilience they needed to survive centuries of dispersion, persecution, and the constant threat of despair. It was genius. #Tech Data V, reception, sanctity, and the controversy over study.
Okay, we've traced the Zohar's creation, its core ideas, and its radical rebirth through Luria after the Spanish expulsion. But we need to address its reception. It was clearly powerful, but you mentioned it was never universally accepted. How did a text that achieved such profound sanctity for so many also become a source of intense controversy, even fierce criticism and censure?
Yeah, the Zohar's entire history is marked by this constant tension, this push and pull between reverence and suspicion. On the one hand, as we've seen, it was absolutely lauded by many rabbis, especially those mystically inclined. They saw it as a vital spiritual antidote.
An antidote to what?
To what they perceived as religious formalism, a Judaism that had become too dry, too focused on legal minutiae, potentially losing its inner fire. The Zohar, they felt, reinvigorated prayer, gave profound meaning to the commandments, and provided that necessary spiritual depth. For Kabbalists, its authority grew to rival and in some ways emotionally surpass even the Talmud. It effectively became the third holiest textual corpus of Judaism after the Torah and Talmud.
Okay, that's the reverence side. But then there was strong censure, especially from the rationalist camp. Those who followed the philosophical path of Maimonides, what were their main complaints?
The rationalists fundamentally feared destabilization. They argued, often quite forcefully, that the Zohar propagated many superstitious beliefs.
Because of all the mystical elements.
Exactly. The Zohar is drenched in mythic language, complex angelology, demonology, descriptions of magical practices, reincarnation, communication with souls. From a strict rationalist perspective, this looked like a dangerous slide into irrationality. They worried it produced a host of mystical dreamers whose focus would be diverted from disciplined ethical behavior and rational legal observance, halakha.
And this fear, this worry about destabilization wasn't just theoretical. It seemed to become horrifyingly real in the 17th century, right? With the whole Shabbatai, Ibi, Messianic movement.
Ah, yes. That was the absolute watershed moment, the crisis that seemed to confirm the rationalists' worst fears. The Shabbatian movement, led by the self-proclaimed Messiah Shabbatai Ubi, swept through the entire Jewish world in the 1660s, causing immense upheaval and ultimately mass disillusionment when he converted to Islam.
And that movement was connected to the Zohar.
Deeply rooted in it. Shabbatian theology drew heavily on the messianic expectations, the cosmic symbolism, and the Lurianic ideas of tikkun found in Zoharic literature. So when the movement imploded, its disastrous effects were widely seen by the rabbinic establishment as the ultimate undeniable proof of the Zohar's obnoxious influences. It became Exhibit A for the dangers of unchecked popular mysticism.
Did this lead to more direct attacks on the Zohar itself, on its authenticity?
It absolutely did. In the aftermath of the Shabbatian disaster, figures like Rabbi Jacob Emden, a formidable Talmudist and anti-Shabbatin polemicist in the 18th century, launched systematic critiques aiming to prove the Zohar was a forgery. He meticulously pointed out its grammatical errors, its anachronisms.
Like the 13th century mezuzah style we talked about.
Exactly. Emden famously noted things like the Zohar's use of the Portuguese word esnoga for synagogue, clearly impossible for a 2nd century Palestinian text. The critics basically argued, look, this text is a lie, and this lie leads directly to chaos and heresy.
It's also fascinating that the Zohar's influence wasn't just an internal Jewish debate. You mentioned earlier that even Christian scholars got interested.
Indeed. During the Renaissance, quite a few prominent Christian Hebraists, scholars like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, became fascinated by the Zohar. They learned Hebrew and Aramaic specifically to study it.
Why? What did they see in it?
They believed, or hoped, that the Zohar contained hidden proofs or echoes of Christian doctrines. They looked at the complex structure of the Sephirot, particularly the top three, Keter, Chokmah, Bina, and saw analogies to the Christian concept of the Trinity. For them, the Zohar wasn't just Jewish mysticism, it was potentially ancient wisdom that validated their own faith. So it became this intellectual and spiritual magnet, drawing in seekers from different traditions.
Okay, given all this, the perceived dangers, the historical trauma linked to it, like Shabbatinism, it brings up a crucial question. What were the actual traditional rules about studying the Zohar? Who was supposed to be allowed access to this powerful, potentially dangerous knowledge? Who could enter the orchard, as the mystical saying goes?
Right, and this is where we need to clear up a common misunderstanding. You often hear today that the rule was you had to be 40 years old, married, etc.
That's the popular idea.
It is. But while the age of 40 symbolized maturity, it wasn't the main or official historical barrier. The real traditional prerequisite, the one actually codified in halakhic sources like the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, was primarily about intellectual and spiritual qualification.
Meaning what specifically?
Meaning you first had to fill his belly with Talmud and codes. You needed proven mastery of halakha, of Jewish law and Talmudic reasoning. The foundation had to be rock solid before you ventured into the potentially disorienting world of mystical speculation.
So law first, then mysticism, if you're ready.
Exactly. The study was traditionally reserved for scholars who demonstrated not just vast Torah knowledge, but also significant spiritual maturity qualities like modesty, humility, emotional stability, even financial independence, so they wouldn't be tempted to misuse the knowledge. It was about readiness, about preventing the kind of intellectual and spiritual destabilization the rationalists feared.
And you pointed out that many great Kabbalists, like the Ari himself, actually died before reaching 40.
Precisely. which shows that age wasn't the absolute barrier. It was the level of learning and spiritual discipline that truly mattered.
Okay, so that was the traditional conservative approach, restrict access to the qualified elite. But then you mentioned a powerful counter-tradition emerged, especially after the expulsion and with the rise of Lurianic Kabbalah, an argument that said, no, Kabbalah is not just a luxury for the few anymore.
Yes, a radical reversal. This view was championed by some of the greatest mystical figures themselves, including the Ari back in the 16th century, and later, very forcefully, by someone like the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, who was a towering intellectual figure in 18th century Lithuania, respected by both mystics and legalists.
And what did they argue? That the restrictions should be lifted?
They actively argued for overriding the restrictions. The Vilna Gaon, for instance, argued strongly that in later generations studying Kabbalah wasn't just permitted, it was an obligation.
An obligation to study mysticism. That directly contradicts centuries of caution. What was that justification for such a massive policy shift?
They put forward two main urgent arguments. First, what you might call the spiritual antidote argument. They claimed that the world, especially in modern times, was experiencing a tremendous descent of the generations, a period of increasing spiritual darkness, assimilation, loss of faith, growing cynicism.
The challenges of modernity.
Exactly. And in such a dark time, they argued, the powerful, illuminating light of Kabbalah is not a luxury, it is necessary. It's the elixir of life, the only spiritual medicine strong enough to revitalize the Jewish soul and combat the drift towards apathy or assimilation. Without the inner dimension provided by Kabbalah, they feared Judaism would wither into that very religious formalism the Zohar originally fought against.
So it's needed now more than ever to keep the faith alive. What was the second argument?
The second argument tied directly back to Luria and the whole framework of Tikkun Olam and Messianism.
Okay.
Figures like the Ari and the Vilna Gaon taught that the process of redemption required the active dissemination of this mystical knowledge. They interpreted biblical verses to mean that the outward dissemination of the wellsprings, teaching Kabbalah, sharing the Zohar's inner dimension with the masses, is the crucial, necessary preparation for the coming of the Messiah.
So spreading Kabbalah actually hastens the redemption.
That became the belief. Spreading this knowledge wasn't just about individual enlightenment, it became a cosmic messianic duty. The world could only be fully repaired, Tikkun Olam could only be completed, and the Messiah could only arrive once the path, the inner dimension of Torah, was understood by everyone.
So looking back, we see this fascinating 500-year power struggle. On one side, the legalists, the rationalists, fearing destabilization, heresy, and mystical excess. On the other, the mystics, arguing that without the soul, the inner life provided by the Zohar and Kabbalah, the law itself becomes just dead, ritual, empty formalism.
It's a fundamental tension about the nature of faith itself. And you have to say, in the long run, the mystics largely won this argument, at least in terms of popular influence.
How so?
Well, today, the Zohar's core terminology concepts like the Sephirot, Ein Sof, Shekinah, the Lurianic ideas of Tzimtzum, Shavira, Klippot, Netzutzot, and especially Tikkun Olam, these concepts form the basic spiritual vocabulary for huge segments of the modern Jewish world. From Hasidism, which is deeply rooted in Kabbalah, to various contemporary spiritual movements, even influencing mainstream synagogue life. The Zohar's inner dimension has, in many ways, become the default language for talking about Jewish spirituality. That forged text ended up providing the very soul that the tradition it disrupted desperately needed, according to his proponents. #outro.
What an incredible journey. We've really tried to tell the whole story today, tracing the Zohar's absolutely central paradox. How a 13th century Spanish forgery, likely created by one brilliant, perhaps desperate man trying to inject revolutionary ideas into a conservative system, somehow achieved the sanctity of a 2nd century sacred text.
Right, a text attributed to an ancient sage.
And it survived centuries of intense controversy, attacks on its authenticity, the devastating fallout from the Shabbatine movement, only to explode into global Jewish consciousness as the essential spiritual response to the trauma of the 1492 expulsion. And from there, it became this foundational guide for navigating modernity.
It really is an astonishing story. And I think the Zohar's enduring legacy, despite all the controversy, lies precisely in that transformative power we've been discussing. It fundamentally changed the metaphysical landscape for millions.
How would you summarize that transformation?
Well, it took the concept of God from potentially being just a distant, inscrutable lawgiver and redefined God as the dynamic, interactive, even vulnerable Ein Sof, manifesting through the Sephirah. It transformed the universe from potentially just a static, finished creation into this dramatic, ongoing cosmic battlefield of trapped divine sparks and concealing husks.
A world in need of repair.
Exactly. And maybe most importantly, it transformed the individual person, the individual Jew, from being potentially just a passive subject obeying laws into an indispensable active partner in the cosmos, a cosmic actor.
An actor whose everyday choices, whose seemingly small acts of righteousness or contemplation directly impact the healing and restoration of the entire divine structure. That whole process of tikkun olam.
Yes. It fundamentally redefined the purpose of existence as a restorative mission. It gave humanity this crucial, necessary, almost messianic role in the ongoing drama of cosmic healing and completion.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final, maybe provocative thought to mull over. The Zohar, born out of a deep need for spiritual renewal, created through an act of profound deception, and later canonized by the collective trauma of exile, ultimately teaches that every small, conscious, righteous action you take resonates far beyond your own life. It has echoes in the ultimate healing and restoration of the entire divine fabric of reality.
It gives immense meaning to everyday life.
It really does. So here's the thought. If a book born of pseudepigraphy, a technical forgery, could achieve such immense spiritual power and fundamentally redefine the relationship between humanity and the infinite, what foundational beliefs or assumptions do you hold today, perhaps unquestioningly, that might be equally revolutionary, equally world-changing if they were reframed by a larger, more urgent, more participatory cosmic story?
That's a powerful question to sit with. The power of narrative, the power of reframing reality. It's immense.
It certainly is. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Zohar. We hope it gave you plenty to think about. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.